Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Andrew Townsend. I'm marketing operations here at Smarty. Today's webinar is an advanced look at US Autocomplete Pro API, and we're really excited to get started to dive into this and take a look at it. Hopefully, everybody here already knows what US Autocomplete Pro API is. If not, we'll define that shortly. However, before I get started, let me go over a couple bits of housekeeping, just a couple of housekeeping items. Number one, this webinar will be recorded. It's recording right now. We will send a copy of this recording to everybody who registered. So you can be looking for that in your inbox, hopefully later today, possibly tomorrow. This does mean that if you need to step out, you can view that recording later, pick up right where you left off. Or if you know someone that might benefit from this recording, you can share it with them by just hitting the forward button on your email. To interact with our presenter and other audience members, feel free to use the chat and Q&A features inside of the Zoom webinar control interface. I will be taking your questions to our presenter as we have time for that. So be ready to, if you have questions, please use the tool in Zoom, the Q&A and the chat. All right, so our presenter today, we have Bryan Amundson, one of our genius software engineers with us, and we're very excited to hear what he's going to share with you. So without further ado, Bryan Amundson.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. So as he said, my name is Bryan. I'm the principal engineer for US Autocomplete Pro. And so I'm very passionate about autocomplete. I think it solves a lot of problems. So let's just get started about what this webinar is about. Again, hopefully you're a little bit familiar with it. If you're not, then I think you will be by the time this is over. So first of all, we want to talk about integrating Autocomplete Pro into your address forms. We've got a really easy way to do that, and we'll show you in a second. And then we want to discuss the advanced features, geolocation, what does it mean, how to use it, preferences, filters, source, which essentially, our autocomplete can give you postal and non-postal addresses, which is handy in a lot of situations. And then the selected parameter, which we'll explain in just a little bit. And as you see in the documentation hopefully is good. When I wrote it, I wanted to make sure and have all the details in there. So hopefully it will be helpful for you. So first of all, integrating Autocomplete Pro into your web forms or into your website. A lot of times when you look at an autocomplete widget, it's much more complicated than just writing a piece of JavaScript that just goes out and queries and displays. It has highlighting, it has expansion of secondary units and so on and so forth. So if you've ever thought, I wish that I could integrate with it, but it just is a little bit too complicated. I've got a JS Fiddle for you. So that is the first JS Fiddle link. Let me show you a little bit about what that is. This, if you've ever been on Smarty's website, this is basically the demo. And so we've provided all source code, CSS, JavaScript, HTML, everything you need in order to be able to integrate Autocomplete Pro into your website. We'll just, a little quick demo. As you can see, it highlights, it also allows you to be able to click on any address that has secondaries, and it lists those secondaries and so forth. So hopefully this will be helpful to you guys. And so that's all we'll say about that, because there's just a little bit involved about integrating that into your form, but I think that'll give you a nice boost. There's another JS Fiddle that we're going to be working with today, and that's that second link down there. This allows you to be able to mess around with all of the options that are available in Autocomplete Pro. So it allows you to be able to experiment with all the filters, with geolocation, and we're going to be going over all of these today. By the way, here's a nice little tasty treat. I don't know whether or not you know this in JS Fiddle. I just happened to discover it kind of by accident. But if you put in show at the end, and if you spell it right, if you put in show at the end of the URL, it actually allows you to run the view part without all of the code getting in the way. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful to you in one way or another. So geolocation, what is geolocation? Essentially, it is allowing the user to be able to see addresses that are close to their current location. So what we do is we take the IP of the user, the end client, and we look it up in a table to see of all of the IP addresses in the world, what city and state are they closest to. And then what we do is we take that information once we've got their city and state, and it's not 100% accurate, unfortunately. We have to rely upon the data providers to give us that. But like in large metropolitan or large areas, it may think that you're in a different city, but it's going to be fairly close geographically. But what we do is we take that city and that state and put it into the preferred cities field. And we'll discuss that in a little bit. But that just gives you kind of an overview of how we use geolocation within Autocomplete Pro. Let's do a little demo. So I need to move that out of the way. So let's look at the geolocation options. There's two options. There's city and there's none. None obviously turns it off. I am in Provo, Utah. And so if I start typing in addresses, because it's turned on, you'll see that the results come up for me around my geographical area. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it fans out from exactly where I am, but it's just in my city and state. So that is essentially how geolocation works. Now let's get onto the preferred or the preferences, and this is where you can see that we put the city and state in there. First of all, preferences are, it kind of gives you, it bubbles up better results up to the top. And by top, I mean whatever the prefer ratio is set to. So if you have a prefer ratio set to 75, that means 75% of your results, the first 3 quarters, are going to be results that are based upon the preferences that you set. By default, it's 100. We figured that you probably want to see all of the results that are close to your geolocation or whatever preferences you do. But you can certainly reduce that if you want to. Then we've got the preferred cities, and you can see in the slide that you can specify multiple cities in a state. All of those are separated by commas, and then whenever you go to a different city-state combination, you separate it with a semicolon. Then there's the preferred states. If you just want to see addresses in a particular state, then you can put the preferred states. If you have 3 or 4 states, it's not necessarily going to pull a 10% out of this state and 10% out of this state. It's not necessarily going to do that. But when you start to type your address and narrow things down just a little bit, it will it'll bubble up. The right addresses will bubble up to the top. Then we've got a preferred zip codes where you can just specify a zip code. Because you're specifying a zip code, none of the other prefers are available at that point. So if you put in a zip code, you can't specify anything else. And you want to turn the preferred geolocation to none off when you're dealing with zip codes. So let's do a little demo and take a look at some of these preferences. So first of all, the preferred ratio, let's set it down to 50%. And let's start looking at some addresses. So you'll notice that half of my addresses now are coming from Provo, and that's because of my geolocation set on. The rest of them are just random matches around the country. Let's put that back up to 100 on the prefer ratio. And let's say that we want to prefer a specific city. Reno, Nevada is always a very popular city, so now you can see that we're getting all results from Reno, Nevada. If we want to prefer any city in Texas, or let's say Louisiana as well. So now we can see that we've got Louisiana, but there's no Texas addresses yet. Again, we don't split them up and say you've got 5 preferred states. But if you narrow it down, then Texas addresses will start bubbling up to the top. And then zip codes. This is around where I grew up in Logan, Utah. And I put it in the wrong spot. And I really may have put it in the wrong spot. Yeah, it's the demo gods, isn't it? Actually, we need to turn this off. Otherwise, we're going to conflict. All right. So now we see preferences from 84321. So anyway, that just allows you to be able to bubble up your preferences of where you want to show your results from up to the top.
Bryan, a quick question has come up.
Sure.
Someone says that geolocation is based on the user's IP address, as I understand it. So could a user using a VPN in Texas or even out of the country be a problem?
It all depends. If you're going through proxies or somewhere along those lines, yes, it could affect it. Basically, when you're on your browser and it sends a request, it has your IP address embedded in it.
Sure.
In the headers. And so if you go through some proxies and other things before you get to an autocomplete server, it could change that IP address, possibly. We try to determine whether or not that has happened. But if that IP address for some reason is lost during that translation, which really it shouldn't be, then it should work. But there's always that possibility.
Sure. Thanks.
All right. So those are the preferences. Let's get into filters. So filters allow you to be able to only display specific things, not just preferring specific addresses. So just like in the preferences, you can specify multiple cities and states. There is another option here with the states, and that is there's a couple of keywords. We found that when we look through the logs and see how people are using the product, that sometimes they would specify all 50 states in the include only states because they wanted to exclude territories, or they wanted to exclude Alaska and Hawaii since if they didn't ship there or whatever. And so we wanted to be able to provide some keywords that made that just a little bit easier. So contiguous is all the contiguous 48 states plus DC. All states would be Hawaii and Alaska as well, with none of the territories. And then we've got another one that's include only zip codes. That again is something that cannot be used with any other filters. So let's take a look at some of the filter options. So if we want to include only states, let me turn this off for this page. If we wanted to include only states, for example, New York, then we would only see from New York. which is different from preferences in that if you start typing an address and there are none in New York and you had New York as a preference, it could still display other states. With filters, it only will allow those particular states or cities or zip codes to be shown. So that's the difference between preferences and filters. There is an exclude filter as well. This one, definitely you don't want your preferred geolocation to be on if you want to exclude specific states. Otherwise, what could happen is you could get local results that are not filtered out that could be in that particular state. So exclude states, the syntax is just like the other ones, just states separated by semicolons. That's hard to do. That's hard to demo. So you'll just have to take our word for it that it works. All right, the source. There are two separate data sources that we pull from. One is from USPS, which is the basis for all postal addresses. And then we have some other sources for non-postal addresses. And you're probably saying, what is a non-postal address? Well, when I lived in the outskirts of town, 20 miles from nowhere, the post office would deliver our mail to a big box out on the road. And our address was HC 13 box 148. Well, that's not a real physical address. If you gave that to a UPS man, he would say, I have no idea what you're talking about. But I did have a physical address, 14349 South Lariat Circle. So that is an example of a non-postal address. It's a physical address, and UPS and FedEx delivered to it, but the post office really doesn't know anything about it. And so if you want to have non-postal addresses delivered, you set the source parameter to all. It is postal by default, so you don't accidentally get those non-postal addresses if you don't want them. And how you can determine, and we'll show you this in a second here, how you can determine if an address is non-postal or postal, it has a source field in the response that says either other or postal. And you can see that in our little demo page here, that if, let me first of all get rid of that, that when we start typing, you see these addresses with a star. This means that they are non-postal addresses since I have my source set to all. And again, you can turn that on and off depending upon what you want to accomplish. So that is source. Now let's move on to the selected. And this is the most complicated one of all. Luckily enough, we have implemented this in both of those fiddles that I showed you before. But this allows you to be able to expand the secondaries. Each address that comes back from our API, it has some information, such as the street line and the secondary, which the secondary is basically how much of a secondary that you have currently typed. And then it shows you the entries. So that is the number of entries that fit that secondary parameter. So in this case, this 1042 West Center Street, it has some apartments and there are 108 of them. And so based on that, the selected parameter that you can send to back to the API is the entire address, and then whatever they have typed in so far for their secondary, and then the number, basically the number of entries. And I'll show you that number is not necessarily totally sacred. If you specify apartment A and 15, but yet there are 40 apartments, it'll still return 40 apartments. I'll tell you a little bit about what that means here in a second. What will happen though when you send the selected parameter, it'll only return the first 100. So if there are 14,000, which I think there are in one area in New York, that many secondaries within a particular address, it will still only return the first 100. And you then will encourage your user to keep on typing to try to narrow that down. And the more you narrow it down, the smaller that number will become. So you can see in this slide that we had talked about before, if they type in apartment A, there are 24 apartments that begin with A. So let's go ahead and do a little demo on that. This allows us to be able to, let's see, let's do it this way. So here is something in Fair Lawn, New Jersey that has 9 entries. If we click on that, we can see that it returns all 9 for that particular address. But there's also this nice little selected parameter here in our test fiddle that fills that in for you. And you can mess around with this. Let's see, this is probably not the best example of an address because they all begin with 1. But only a few of them begin with 10. So we can type in suite 10, and here is where that number comes in. If that is the total number of secondaries that are going to be returned, it'll still return all of those secondaries. We're just going to say, let's just make it 1 less. And what that does then is it will only return those addresses that begin with 10. So it'll take a little bit of fooling around with it and playing around with it. But the bottom line is that the format of this can be constructed from the results that come back. And again, it's strictly for user interfaces to be able to get a list of all of the secondaries and know how many secondaries that are going to be there. If, when we look at the demo, we can see that it does specify the number of entries, and that corresponds with this entries that comes back from the API. So bottom line is, selected parameter always must use the full address with the full partial secondary value that is specified within the secondary field that is returned. Another thing that I think is kind of important is that the search parameter, it really doesn't have to contain anything of use. You could even put blah or taco, which is one of my favorite variable names, in the search parameter, but it has to be there and it has to contain something, but you can really put anything in it. So don't stress too much about the search parameter. It's the selected parameter that is the important part. And so that is all of the parameters that you can use within Autocomplete Pro. So just as a summary, and then we'll take some questions. It assists users when entering their own addresses into the system, provides better suggestions for call centers or what have you, allows them to be able to it really protects your database from having a bunch of garbage in it. So I would highly suggest that Autocomplete Pro be used in your input web forms. You can search for postal and non-postal addresses. You can also do that in Smarty's US Street API. With the enhanced search mode. And then of course you can get secondaries for a particular address. So that is the presentation. Andrew, do we have any questions?
Yes, we do. This person says, we are using Java 8 with your SDK for Java 8. We are trying to use this city or zip code filter, but we've been told by support it no longer is supported. on the older SDKs. Does this mean the advanced filters are only being supported in Java 11?
That I don't know about. The
Sweet.
yeah, I'll have to find out about Java 8. It could very well. Yeah, I'll have to find out about that.
We can reach out after the session to talk about that. I think you've got one more slide for me, Bryan. Feel free to send in any other questions you guys may have, but before we answer any more, I do want to let you know if you're not already using US Address Autocomplete, and I think a large portion of you probably are, and you're just wanting to learn more about it. But if you're thinking about using Address Autocomplete, you can get a free trial of it. Just go to smarty.com/sign up, get a free account, and once you get inside, you'll see all of the different trials you can grab. Just click on the one that says US Address Autocomplete, and you'll be set. We actually don't have any other questions I see here. So just a reminder that we will send out a recording of this session out to everyone. I will reach out to you who asked about the Java 8 with an answer to your question later in the day as well. Thanks everybody for joining us. Thank you, Bryan, for your time and your knowledge and for sharing all that with us. And we hope that we will see everyone in our next webinar. Thanks.
Good day.